Welkom terug by die groot ontbyt. Dr. Berend Mets is 'n skrywer wat nou al vir jaar lank mense betower met sy historiese roman. Die nuutste ene wat hy nou skryf is Truth and Conciliation is die nuutste roman wat hy geskryf het. Dis diepgaande emosioneelgelaaide verhaal wat gaan of werklikheid of dit werklik is dat vergifnis 'n mens kan bevry of nie. Kan daai vergifnis 'n mens vrymaak of onthou jy 'n stukkie daarvan? Hy kuier vanmôre saam met ons meer oor die roman te gesels. Good morning. How are you?
Very nice to be here. And I kan ook een beetje Afrikaans praten. Probeer, ja. Ik was bij de Universiteit van Stellenbosch, so ik moest geleerd het om Afrikaans te praten.
Berend, let's talk about the book itself. Let's talk about the influences. You have a wide experience and variety in traveling across the world, many continents. How does that come in to your writing? How does that feature in your writing? Does it affect the way you look at things? Does it affect the way this book handles the big question of forgiveness?
Yes. So I was born in Indonesia from Dutch parents, and as a youth, traveled across the world. My father was a doctor, as I am, of course. And so I lived in Singapore, in Indonesia, in Holland, in England, in the West Indies. And then eventually we moved here to South Africa, where I went to high school, medical school, and became an anesthesiologist. As part of my job as a international anesthesiologist, I now work at the Pennsylvania State University. I've traveled around and, of course, seen multiple different cultures. But ultimately, what I wanted to write about as a historic, I'm a medical historian, I wanted to write something that I really care about, which is recent South African history. So I started studying that. And in order to write these two books, I actually took a Master's in Fine Art in Creative Writing to learn how to write fiction, because I think fiction can ultimately engage the reader more than a solid history book, because people get empathetic with the characters. And as a result of that, I wrote these two books. The first one was Immorality Act, which relates a multiracial love triangle in 1960 South Africa, just after the Sharpeville massacre, as the country hurtles to becoming a republic. So we have the personal crisis of the threesome and the crisis, if you will, of the Republic of South Africa becoming a republic after the referendum. And for Truth and Conciliation, I sought another pivot point in South Africa's recent history, and that was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings, which were, of course, helmed by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, for whom I've always had enormous respect. So I situated a story around that from two different points of view. More specifically from the black point of view, through a character, a fictitious character completely, of course, Thembisa Dlamini, who's a Xhosa police detective, and Pieter Marais, who's an Afrikaner doctor. And they come into an interaction over a murder that was committed on Signal Hill. Now, both of them have suffered from the consequences of South African violence. Thembisa Dlamini in the Soweto riots of 1976, and Pieter Marais from the Angolan border war, in 1980. And ultimately, the book then hinges around whether these two, because of a crime that was committed under the apartheid regime, will bring them together or separate them.
You know, you speak about the fiction, but it's based on South African history, yes. and that makes it relatable for the reader. How do you make sure these characters are authentic, that the South African reader can relate to these characters?
Yes, and it's an excellent question. Part of it is that I studied South African writers writing about South Africa as part of the Masters in Fine Art. So I specifically chose South African writers like Andre Brink, for example, in order to learn to use the vernacular. Now, I know the vernacular, of course, because, you know, ek kan 'n bietjie Cape praat ook as ek dit moet. And so this appears in the book. And I hope I've done it justice. And of course, the reader will judge whether that's correct. but I really wanted to represent it from two different points of view, truth and conciliation, so that we get a flavor of what the personalities are like. And readers will have to judge, but sometimes it's very interesting that you start writing, for example, Tembisa Dlamini is a police detective, and as I started writing her, of course I read an enormous about Soweto and many other historical texts for obvious reasons. What I also tapped was Max Dupree's fantastic work from 1996 to 1998. On the SABC broadcasts that were sent out every Sunday night. There were about 90 plus of them. So I went through all of them, and I have to commend all the people who came forward to tell their truths. And it's only from that and the forgiveness that people rendered others who had made them suffer that there is this chance that the Rainbow Nation will continue. Now, Bishop Desmond Tutu said something about this, which was very interesting. He said, "It as if the suffering of the victims had ripped them open with empathy so that they could give that forgiveness that was required to move on. Not to ever forget, but to forgive and let the country move on, to recover from, the sweeping sepsis that had engulfed it, which might have put it into civil war, but then didn't."
You refer to the fact that the Rainbow Nation could continue, the option of that being a reality. You refer to the fact that forgiveness is tough and it isn't easy. I mean, how do these concepts of forgiveness and truth and reconciliation, how do you think in this book and in your own personal life, in your own religious beliefs, how do you think in this couple of years that we've gone through now, where people seem to be pulled apart further and further from each other, and the classes and the races and the groups and the ethnicities being almost segregated from each other on a social level, not on a state level, do you see hope? Is there optimism? Is there, in your mind, a chance for forgiveness and conciliation? Once again, a second reconciliation, that maybe that's what we need.
Yes, I certainly believe so, and I believe the watchword is colorblind, i.e., everybody's treated irrespective of their color, their creed, or their religion. They are treated as a human being, and that's the ultimate state that we should be living towards for all of us. And the epigram of this book is, to err is human, and to forgive is divine. And that's how I start the book off. And of course, this is something that Bishop Desmond Tutu said as well. And if one can forgive, but not have to forget, then we can actually move on to a better place. And that's where I hope. And this book ends in a note of hope, exactly as well. So I like the shape of the book. It opens with an interesting state, which is, if I may, a character from Immorality Act. Promise Madiba is a nurse at Grootskuur Hospital, and she is living with Maria de Koning, who is a former prostitute, with her, Promise Madiba's 3-year-old son. And the house they live in District 6 is slated for destruction, for forced removal. The arresting officer is Pieter Marais, and he arrives on the scene and he says they need to be evicted. Promise Madiba says, "No, I won't have the destruction of my house." And so she then gets arrested, and Maria de Koning is left with the child. Pieter Marais then says to her, makes a proposal: "I will marry you, and it is within my power to change your color." She's colored at that stage. "And make you white, and it'll be better for the boy. But there is only one condition, that the boy will be called Pieter Marais, and he will be never told the truth." And Maya takes the Faustian bargain. And of course, that's where the story starts and unwinds from there.
Lots of potential for things to go awry, yet some hope in it as well at the end. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Berend. Thank you. I think Truth and Conciliation is a book that we need at the moment, and it is a read that I think can help the rest of us also shed a little light on where we are now and where we've come from, which we tend to forget very easily.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here this
Thank you very much for having me.